Chapter 4: Market Failures, Public Goods, and Externalities. This chapter seeks to define a market failure and the consequences of a market failure. The chapter begins by looking at the demand side of market failures, the supply side of market failures, and the inefficiencies found. It goes on to describe and show both consumer and producer surpluses. It defines and describes private goods, public goods, and the free rider problem, and quasi-public goods. It shows how to find the optimal amount of public goods the government should produce using a cost-benefit approach, and finishes with a discussion of government failure. Market failures. Market failures occur when the competitive market system produces the wrong amounts of certain goods or services, or fails to provide any at all. Resources that are either over-allocated to the production of the good or under-allocated to the production of the good. Demand-side market failures. Demand-side market failures occur because there are situations when it is impossible to charge all consumers or any consumers the price that they are willing to pay. So it's when it is not possible to charge consumers for the product. Some can enjoy benefits without paying. A public fireworks display is an example where people don't have to pay to enjoy the display. Firms not willing to produce since they cannot cover the cost. Private firms would be unwilling to produce outdoor displays as it will be impossible to raise enough revenue to cover production costs. Firms can't prevent people from watching the fireworks if they didn't pay. Supply-side market failures. Supply-side market failures occur because there are extra costs associated with producing the good, but the extra costs are not reflected in the supply. So it occurs when a firm does not pay the full cost of producing its output. External costs of producing the good are not reflected in the supply. A coal-burning power plant provides an example of this. The firm running the plant pays for the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that it uses to generate electricity, but it does not pay for the smoke it releases into the atmosphere, or the pollution, and the damage it causes to the atmosphere. Efficiently functioning markets. Demand curves must reflect the consumer's full willingness to pay. Supply curve must reflect all the cost of production. When there aren't any market failures and demand fully reflects consumers' willingness to pay, and supply reflects all costs, then by producing at equilibrium, the market is efficient. The market is producing the amount of output that society desires. An efficient market will maximize benefits to consumers and producers. And that's our key point from this presentation, that an efficient market will maximize the benefits to consumers and producers. Consumer surplus. When the consumer's utility exceeds the price paid, consumer surplus is generated. So it's the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good and what the consumer actually pays. It's the extra benefit from paying less than the maximum price. You received consumer surplus anytime you're willing to pay a higher price, but actually paid a lower price. Think about buying a new car. If you walk out of the dealership paying $2,000 less than the maximum price you were willing to pay, then you have realized a consumer surplus of $2,000. This table represents the consumer surplus that each buyer receives. The surplus is just the difference between the price they are willing to pay and the actual price they paid to give a consumer surplus. For example, if we look at Bob was maximum price willing to pay was $13, actually paid the equilibrium price of $8, and generated a $5 consumer surplus. If we look at Barb, for instance, maximum price willing to pay was $12, paid the equilibrium price of $8, and therefore enjoyed a consumer surplus of $4. It is assumed that all consumers will pay the equilibrium price for the good. Although, as you can see, not all consumers will have a surplus. Let's look at Betty. Maximum price willing to pay was $8, and that was the actual equilibrium price. Therefore, she did not enjoy a consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, shown as the green triangle on this graph, is the difference between the maximum prices consumers are willing to pay for a good and the equilibrium price. Here, the equilibrium price is assumed to be $8. For quantity Q1, Consumers are willing to pay the sum of the amounts represented by the green triangle and the yellow rectangle. Because they need to pay only the amount shown as the yellow rectangle, the green triangle shows consumer surplus.